Good evening, everyone. I'm joined here tonight with Matt Parrott. Hey, Matt, welcome on my show.
Hey, Robert, I'm glad to be here.
So you're active with the Council of Conservative Citizens. You have a branch here in Indiana called Hoosier Nation.
Yes.
So could you tell us a little bit about your activism?
Absolutely. There was previously a chapter in Indiana for the Council of Conservative Citizens, but it had gone dormant. And it seemed like an excellent opportunity for me to dive into white American advocacy, which is something I'd wanted to do for years, but I stepped back. I wanted to make sure I did it intelligently, took some time to plan it out, figure out exactly what my message was and how I was going to deliver it. I actually wrote a book, Hoosier Nation, to kick off the chapter that summarizes some of the traditional conservative views and explains how we're a people, both by tradition and as a tribe of an extended family of blood. And so far, it's gone very well. I'm proud to say that we have several great people here in Indiana who've been very active, who've really helped me and helped the group, of course, and helped the cause through attending tea parties, through town hall meetings. We actually engage local representatives and such. We protest in downtown Indianapolis with up to 30 people at a time are attending these protests for an Arizona-style illegal immigration bill in defense of white people here in Indiana who are being unfairly targeted by the multi-cult establishment, and taking on more specific cultural issues like the recent machete protests that Andrew Yeoman masterminded on a national level, and we here at Hoosier Nation jumped on top of that.
We talked about that in this show, our last interview. So you've been out there in the Tea Party. I know a lot of people are skeptical of the Tea Party movement, but what kind of reaction have you gotten, and what are your thoughts on that movement, which you've been involved with?
I wrote an article about that at my blog, delightsome.wordpress.com. I called the Tea Party the American Revolutionary Cargo Cult. And for those who aren't familiar, the cargo cults are these islanders out in the Pacific who were visited by all these cargo planes during World War II and basically created a religion based on these flying planes and stuff that they had no context for, and in fact fly American flags and other symbols without really understanding the context, have a whole religion based out of it. But what I was getting at with that was that they're borrowing the symbols and the abstractions of the American Revolution, but they're missing the actual underlying pattern that could bring back the American Revolution, that they're sort of a sad case of a people without any leadership, without any elite to bring them toward their goal. It's just...
Well, yeah, there isn't an official policy position or organization, so I think it can be easily co-opted, and there are groups that are trying to co-opt the movement and using it to further their own interests. There's there's Republican establishment, there's corporate interest, and there are a lot of types who are more for foreign policy that doesn't benefit the United States, more like a hawkish interventionist foreign policy. So all these groups, they want their piece of the pie, but they're not really looking out for the best interest of the country, and the movement is very, very vulnerable to that kind of co-option.
Right, absolutely, and I'd say it's more than vulnerable to that. It's actually already a done deal, I'm afraid, as far as the direction they're being pulled toward. Originally, I do believe that Dr. Paul had a huge influence on starting the movement, and he had a very well thought out. I'm certainly not a libertarian myself.
Well, his campaign basically did start it, because I haven't even bothered going to the new Tea Parties out now, but I remember the very first Tea Party type events were basically through Ron Paul's campaign.
Right. And they were concerned about the deficit, about the monetary system, and what's amusing now is they've devolved to where they're just for lower taxes. And lower taxes without lowering services, and they've stopped talking at all about lowering services. They're just about keeping the Bush tax cuts and cutting more taxes, and that's the worst thing you can do for the deficit.
It's completely meaningless. I mean, Bush cut taxes, but we have still had a massive deficit. He didn't do anything about spending, and they talk about less government, but they won't talk about they don't offer concrete solutions. And I've talked about, like, Sarah Palin. She's kind of like the conservative version of Obama, like this way Obama and Sarah Palin, they both give, like, these speeches that rile up their base, but neither of them really, when they were running, offered any kind of concrete plan to fix this nation.
Right. I remember while I was watching the Republican primaries, this was back in, I think, late 2007 even, and I remember watching Dr. Paul, and I was so frustrated because he kept going on about monetary policy and the deficit. And I had talked him up to my family, to my wife and kids, and they were just looking at me like, well, this crazy guy who just rambles about monetary policy and the Federal Reserve is what you're excited about? And it was frustrating because he's got a good position on illegal immigration, obviously not as far as a true ethno-patriot would prefer, but it is in the right direction. And I'm certainly prepared to engage in practical politics, coalition politics, and just try to pull things in the right direction. But what was funny was at that time it seemed so stupid, but in hindsight, he saw what was coming, and when the bailouts hit, when the stock market crashed, within just a few months of me shaking my head in disbelief that he could be so out of touch and radical, that he could be so off the map, and then all of a sudden he's right in the middle of it because circumstances changed in his direction. And I think there's an important lesson for us as white advocates as far as how quickly the zeitgeist can change in our favor. When people start paying attention and really start reflecting on issues, it can be startling how quickly the public imagination can shift. I mean, a few months later I was standing beside a guy holding a sign that said, "In the Fed," right in downtown Indianapolis, surrounded by thousands of people in every direction who had similar sentiments. So when a lot of people say, like, we can't openly advocate for white interests because that's so taboo and everybody who hears that thinks we're crazy, I think back to that moment with me and Ron Paul, and I try to think of potential supporters in that way as, sure, maybe right now they might dismiss me or put me on the back burner or just wonder why I'm going on.
But what do you think has to be done to make the issue less taboo? Do you think a lot of it is, well, the media is obviously against it, but do you think a lot of it is the way people have been presenting it creates a bad image among the public?
I believe that's part of it. The media creates a caricature of us, and unfortunately, we've done a lot to create caricatures of ourselves, of course, with the costumes and the German nationalism and the Klan stuff that's totally anachronistic and inappropriate for the modern context. But I think people fail to realize why the white nationalist movement went down that blind alley. I think they just assumed they were stupid. When in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the media monopoly was so pervasive, you just had a few networks, and all those networks were very centrally controlled. And the ideas that were being promoted were so remote, you would have to appear barking mad to propose that within just a couple of generations, the white America that was at that time, 90% white and dominant and controlling the world, would soon be minority white and an embattled minority in our own country. And I think leaders from that generation, like George Lincoln Rockwell, had a very different context from us, where they had to try to reach people through this hostile media. I think in a lot of ways what they realized was that the only way the media was going to project them was by making caricatures of themselves to try to reach out to people, and then whenever they brought them in, they would give them a different context, a deeper perspective, as George Lincoln Rockwell had. He wasn't the idiot he was portrayed as by the media, or the idiot he often portrayed himself as when he was in character. And I think that's one thing the movement has to realize is that with the internet,
I mean, he was a very intelligent guy, but
absolutely,
he created an image of himself and an image of a movement that most Americans have a very negative view towards. And the key is to try to win the hearts and minds of the public, to win as many people as possible.
Right, and with the internet and with media monopoly falling apart, we no longer have to play that game of the sort of Aikido, luring them in as costume clowns and then trying to reach people after you've got the camera in your face. We no longer have to do that. We can leverage a variety of technologies and tactics that simply weren't available to that generation. And I think people who are still stuck there need to join us in changing paradigm and reaching normal Americans by acting and looking like and frankly being normal white Americans.
And see, do you believe that people should be more open about their views, or they should try to use other movements? Like there's debate about whether people should be explicit about their views or try to infiltrate like the conservative movement.
The problem with that is that we're not a cohesive enough movement to get away with that. The Jews, for instance, have been around for thousands of years and have a very tight-knit community. And they can do things like be conversos for hundreds of years and practice Christianity on the outside while having a menorah downstairs. We can't do that. And over again, we find ourselves trying to play these clever games, and the next generation doesn't get it. The John Birch Society attempted to do that, and now it's been co-opted. Everybody forgot what it was there for in the first place. I have an article called "The War on Thugs" that explains that the war on drugs was largely a racial thing, that they were pretending it wasn't racial, that it was a public health issue, but that the ultimate goal of the war on drugs was to get a handle on ethnic crime. But our modern generation of conservatives doesn't know that because nobody told them what the shtick was, so they just think that the previous generation was retarded and have all these absurdly strict drug laws in place just because they were stupid. And that's what's going to happen if we keep denying our core message. Is we're not going to reach people. We're not in the same situation. We're not cohesive enough. I'd like us to be, perhaps. But at this point, this idea that we should all just go sneak off into different groups and then influence those groups, it is just a terribly bad idea. That's a total blind alley.
Yes, there needs to be some kind of cohesiveness. I mean, I agree people should stand up for what they believe in. And there's still, within movements, you have a more moderate wing, and then there's like a more radical wing, so you have to find some kind of cohesiveness, because I know there's moderates who are very concerned about the image, because the main weapon, the media will say some people have more of a supremacist view, and I think you have to sort of show to the media that you're just for the same rights that other people in other parts of the world have, and their right to their sovereignty for their people. So just pointing out those double standards is what's important, and trying to just prove the myths that the establishment is going to say.
Right, and that's, with my message, it's a traditional conservative message. It's a message that would resonate with most people's great-grandfather. But when I can pull a person aside and talk to them one-on-one, they don't always agree with me, but I can almost always convince them that I'm not evil, that our position is not sinister or absurd in the way that it's projected to be. And it's important.
So you've spoken to the kind of conservative types in the Tea Party about these issues.
Right.
And how have they usually responded?
The people on the street are often very interested in what I have to say, and oftentimes take the paperwork and contact me and follow up with me about it. Very often, it's really encouraging. A lot of times, the leadership is the problem. And a lot of them have even in private intimated that, yeah, I see what you're doing. I know you're not evil, but we're doing this mainstream thing, and we can't associate ourselves with you. So
So yeah, they kind of agree, but people are really they're worried about losing. They want to keep their careers, and they're worried about harming themselves and the repercussions. I think there's a lot of people that just have these basic views, and the one problem with the movement is there's a lot of people across the country, just normal people, who hold these certain principles, but because it's pathological, the movement tends to attract the most radical individuals, and then the most radical individuals create the image. But there's a huge, silent, vast number of people who do share a lot of the views.
Right, and there's no easy answer to that. We just have to patiently work toward projecting a better image, talk to people, engage in practical politics, local activism, and get the word out and not look absurd while doing so. Not wear any pointy hats or imagery that's offensive to ordinary Americans. And we alone are advocating for their best interests. And eventually we can reach them with that message. A libertarian is advocating for an ideology that may or may not, depending on where you fall on any particular issue, be in their interest. Anybody who's an ideologue other than us has something other than the best interest of ordinary white American families. And that's such an advantage for us as we're moving forward, that we alone are their true advocates. And we need to step up to that role with more than just words. We need to be out there on the front lines with this machete thing, being the people who step up and advocate for our people. It's one thing to convince them of the underlying ideology, but there's an even more important battle in demonstrating our competence and our sincerity in actually being their advocates. Because even if they buy our ideology, if we don't demonstrate ourselves to be competent advocates, they'll go elsewhere for leadership.
Yeah, it's just getting people out there and advocating in public, because people need to be exposed to these different ideas, and the more people are exposed to them, the more comfortable that they'll become. People think of it as this kind of, if they don't meet people in person, they just hear about it in the media, then it's kind of a mystery, and then that's how it becomes stigmatized.
Right, and I understand people's concerns, but I think a lot of people fail to realize that things are changing and things are shifting, and the ordinary American mind is far more open to a paradigm shift than it was even 5 years ago, especially 10, 20 years ago. People are more willing to listen to somebody who's overtly against the system. There's very much an us in their field.
It's more about the internet and an open media, or about, do you think a lot of it has to do with Obama's election?
I think it's a real confluence of factors. I think that the internet has more served for the intellectual development of the community. I believe it does serve as an alternative media pathway, but I think what's happening out on the street and in the suburbs and in the trailer parks and the neighborhoods is that people are getting frustrated. It's one thing during a time of economic boom to be told you have to go to the back of the line because you're not the right collar. But as jobs start dwindling and people start really suffering and competing and struggling, and husbands have to go home to their wives and jobless without anything to bring home to their families, they start to see these issues in a less ideological and brainwashed context and start thinking, who's looking out for me? All this stuff about a rainbow nation and about multiculturalism and stuff, all it's adding up for me is that it's not safe for my kids to live in this neighborhood and go to this school, and that's taken on a sharper edge now that with the real estate market and the economy and the growing number of minorities, they can't just go farther out in the suburbs like they did in the past. They can't afford the house there. They're upside down on their mortgage where they're at. And you have to go farther and farther to get to a safe place.
When times are tough, people are more open-minded to new ideas. And if you look at a lot of political movements throughout history, whether they're, I'm not even picking on the movements. It could be the civil rights movement, or it could be Nazism or Marxism, just whatever you think about these movements. Most of these movements came out of difficult times. When things were bad, people became open to these different movements. But when times are good, people usually, when there's prosperity, people tend to go along with the establishment and the status quo.
Right. If I had a refrigerator in my house that constantly had food in it, that every time you took out the milk, another milk would come from behind, I wouldn't mind if all the neighborhood kids came here and ate food. I really wouldn't. The whole neighborhood, the whole town would be welcome to come and get some food out of my refrigerator. But once it's whether my kids eat or your kids eat, it sharpens the mind, and it forces people to reconsider a lot of these very, very fragile, silly ideas that have been promoted over the last.
Yeah, so I think that is happening because we haven't seen this kind of economic downturn in a while, and I have a tendency to get very kind of pessimistic, but I think there's more change and signs of hope that we've seen in a very long time. So I'm kind of tired of just all this pessimism. We just have to look towards the positive trends that we do see happening.
Yeah, I really don't get it either. I get frustrated and confused with people who get like that, because ultimately what we're doing is so important that even if it's doomed, we still need to try to do it. If the cause is worthy enough, you just have to jump in there. Our children's futures are on the line, and it's no small thing to say that when we become a minority in our own country, we see what happened in South Africa. This is truly serious business. The nation that we live in when we're elderly, I guess you're about the same age as me. I'm 28. I'm almost 25, so we're pretty close. Yeah. So at the current rate, it's going to be a dark, literally and figuratively, uncomfortable place for my grandchildren, for my nieces, my nephews, and I, as a grown man, have a responsibility to defend the perimeters. That's part of my role when I came into this world as a man, is to take up, do what needs to be done. And yeah, it can be socially uncomfortable. Lord knows I've been in some situations where I was kind of on edge because everybody was passing judgment on me or whatever. But in the big picture, and that's what's funny about white people, they'll jump in a freezing river to save a dog. But the least bit of social approbation, and it's just game over. If somebody gives them the stink eye at the office, they're out, and it's frustrating. We've got to work past that, and I don't want to be too critical.
It isn't even about money. It's not even about money or social status. There's just something that people are easily susceptible as to guilt. Like if someone makes them feel like they're somehow a bad person, an immoral person for holding certain views, it messes with. They feel bad. It feels bad on their conscience, and it's kind of like mind control. We white folks are we're a very competitive people. So all the invasive elite really had to do was change the definition of respectable and high status to treason, and the rest just takes care of itself. You said that it's the elite which is the root of this problem. One issue I have, a lot of people in these different movements, they will spend so much time bashing all these different ethnic groups, which is counterproductive because it makes them creates a bad image if you're going around bashing all these different groups. But the root of it is the elite that is trying to. I think the elite is focused on really bringing down the sort of the middle class, especially the European American middle class, because they want us more of an authoritarian system. They see it as a threat to their power. The elites in this country are kind of at the root of the problem, but now you sort of agree with that. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think people have to remember that in America, empowered middle class is a historically unique thing, and it's a fragile thing, and it's something we'll lose if we don't very vigorously defend it, because what every elite wants to do is eliminate threats to their power, and the United States Constitution, the United States, our founding values, which were created by white men with white people in mind, with for white progeny, they're always going to be hostile to that, and we have a responsibility to defend our way of life, or we'll lose it, because the elites always want to consolidate their power. It's just natural. It's biological. It's the way of the world.
Do you agree with people who talk about, like, the Jewish elite, when they talk about the white elite? Like, do you think it's an ethnic thing, or do you think it's mostly just purely economic?
I do believe that the Jewish elite is hostile to the white American people and their way of life. I believe the Jewish problem can be overstated, and I believe that it needs to be driven home that the elite is filled with white Americans from Christian Midwestern backgrounds who've betrayed their own people.
You're saying even if a lot of that stuff is true, we've kind of gone along with it, because they do play, I'm not letting them off the hook, they play a significant role, but I think a lot of people, they just make it out to be this boogeyman that's behind everything, so then it makes it more kind of simplistic, and then we sort of lets us off the hook, but I mean, a lot of this is, we're just doing it to ourselves, so that's basically kind of your position on this issue.
Right, I'd say that. I think a large problem is that, especially in America, as the mercantile elite replaced the sort of ancient regime of Europe, which was largely the nobility, which was a martial elite, and the unified church, which was more of a managerial elite. One of the things that the Masonic mercantile value system is about meritocracy, about merit. And one of the ways that that's dangerous is that if you have a system where the superior competitor wins, but the other competitors aren't in on the whole meritocracy principle, it's a game over real quick. And you see that with the Jews. The Jews do outcompete our elites at being managerial elites because they've been adapted for that specific role over thousands of years, both genetically and mimetically. And once they get in those roles, they look out for their own. They don't have this silly notion that we should let the best man win, even if that best man is integrally against you and everything you stand for. And
that's the thing. That's kind of the thing about, you talk about like the capitalism is it's sort of capitalism in the past in this country. It worked where we had a system where if you worked hard, you got a good education, went to a university, you can make decent money. But I see more of the trend of like a permanent oligarchy and a permanent class system being set up. So I mean, it's kind of, I don't know if you want to call it, it's kind of the worst parts of capitalism and socialism combined. I don't even know the word for it. We have like a big government that basically favors the elite. So it's seeing more of a trend towards like a permanent class system. But I don't think that just free people talk, and like the Tea Party movement, they say that free markets are the solution to everything. But that just isn't enough. Because that just, I don't think that really addresses the problem. It is childish. You're absolutely right.
You have to have an indigenous elite with a strong sense of stewardship, of noblesse oblige. I think in a lot of ways China is looking forward to a good century ahead of it because
if you say indigenous, a lot of the elites have always been like scumbags, whether they're indigenous or a foreign elite. I mean, look at look at the European monarchs. I mean, they were all like, most of them were scumbags, but at least they were still somewhat nationalistic.
They were our scumbags.
In their own interest. Yeah, but the elites have always been scumbags throughout history.
One way I like to phrase it is the worst shepherd is better than the best wolf. The most derelict shepherd, whose responsibility is looking out for the flock, even the most self-serving indigenous elite still needs to assure that the population that he's feeding off of and abusing is around to be abused in the future. What's scary about having a hostile alien elite is that sort of perpetuity doesn't matter. They can and will just up and wander off after it all falls apart. But the bottom line is we've got to figure out how to get an indigenous elite that's committed to stewardship for our people.
You're saying indigenous elite, but the thing is, like, if you look at Bush, look at Bush. I mean, his family, they're a lot descended from a lot of the English people who came here in the 1700s. I mean, well, look at the elite in Europe. I mean, it's just, we have big problem with, like, foreign elites, let's talk like the Israeli lobby and AIPAC, all those types, or the Rothschilds in Europe. But I mean, our indigenous elites are treasonous as well. So just indigenous doesn't really get to the root of it. Maybe this may sound kind of, I mean, it may sound socialist to some, but we could put maybe financial restrictions, like start putting limits on how big the banks can get. And I don't know about taxation, maybe taxation stuff too, but that we just have to think of, because just indigenous isn't enough to address the problem, because our indigenous elites are traitors.
Well, that's where the second part of the formula, committed to stewardship. No number of regulations or rules can substitute for having a people who are just truly committed to doing what's right, and that is possible. Any elite, to some extent, is going to fleece the flock, and to some extent, that's not even inappropriate. But there's a difference between fleecing and slaughtering, and you're absolutely right that our elites are destroying our nation and destroying the families and destroying their communities one at a time.
So I'd like to talk a little bit about your kind of religious views. You're a Mormon, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. One of the things you've been discussing is about the compatibility of Christianity with ethno-nationalism, because that is one argument is, like, you're familiar, there's the passage in the New Testament where Christ says, like, there's no Jew, there is no Greek, there is no slave, you're all one in Christ. I've heard people use that passage to try to debunk Christian Zionists who believe that, like, the Jews are God's chosen people, but it can also be used, like some people say that ethno-nationalism is incompatible with Christianity, because one of the messages of Christianity is kind of that people are all one in Christ, and it doesn't, that kind of stuff is kind of superficial, is what I've heard a lot of people make that argument.
Obviously, I don't have any monopoly on explaining or understanding these things, and I have a lot to learn on this front, but I think what a lot of people fail to realize with that is that that's in an esoteric sense. It's not in a literal sense. I do believe that we are all brothers in Christ, regardless of our skin color, and that we do, on an esoteric, on a transcendent level, share a common bond. Now, it's just like we call each other brother and sister at church. Now, they're not actually my brother and sister, and there's a distinction there, and it's easy to manipulate that.
It's kind of the same as how people have more loyalty to their own personal families, but doesn't mean they can still be kind to people of different families, but it's not about that. It's more about the loyalty that someone would have to their own family.
Right. It's two different spheres. It's two different things. It's sort of the give unto Caesar what is Caesar's. Christ's kingdom was not of this world. There are kingdoms of this world, and throughout the Bible, a common theme, one that's never contradicted at any point, is the idea that humans exist in tribes, in nations. And at no point was it stated in the Old Testament or New Testament that all the tribes and nations are to temporally come together as one, that all families are to dissolve into one family, which would follow from that earlier example. And people just need to understand that Christianity doesn't advocate for the dissolution of your nation. It doesn't mean a dissolution of your family. The people I attend church with are my brothers in Christ. They're not my literal brothers, and there's a different relationship I have with those, and it's the same way with a nation. There are people who are members of my nation, my temporal nation here on earth, and I have a special obligation to them. And that's more than merely compatible with the Christian biblical worldview. It's the Christian biblical worldview that was understood by virtually all Christians throughout history up until Christianity was subverted and perverted and inverted here in the last several decades.
How do you think Christianity managed to be subverted like that?
If you don't watch out for it, it's going to happen. And Christianity certainly has no monopoly on having been co-opted and subverted. I get a kick oftentimes. Some white nationalists are like, our religion is science. Well, that's kind of funny because over the last century, science has been subverted, perverted, and inverted in the exact same way.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about political movements. Basically anything, any movement, any ideology, anything can be subverted if people allow it to.
Right, and ultimately we'll have to become wary and aware of Jewish influence. I think one thing people don't realize about Jewish influence is just how thoroughly leveraged it is. It's like with their loans. Throughout history, these massive debts have been accrued, and then people just wake up and realize, wait a minute, these are all abstractions built upon abstractions built upon abstractions in a pyramid scheme of leveraged power, and if we just dismiss them, they'll go away. And in a lot of ways, that same principle, as far as there's this idea of Jews having some sort of supreme power over America, which really isn't true. They have
so you kind of agree. You agree for a certain degree, but you just think some people have a tendency to exaggerate it. That's basically what you're saying.
Yeah, and take it out of its appropriate context. And worse, what's truly problematic is when people build up Jewish perfidy in their minds to the point where they actually become paralyzed and no longer feel like they can win, that their powers
they act
so...
like they have some kind of like it's almost some kind of magical power over everyone, and they just, when you have that kind of mentality, the people feel like they can't win. And it's kind of like, it's the same way what people do with the government. Like I've been listening to Alex Jones, and if people makes people so scared of the government, people are so scared of the government, they're not going to take action, and people are just paralyzed in fear.
Yeah, and people just give up and they retire to their personal lives, assuming that they can't win. And Jews they're just a challenge we have to face. I'm nice to Jews. I talk to Jews. I don't explicitly work with them in any of the contexts I do, because this is an ethnic nationalist movement, and they're a different ethnicity. And that's really the bottom line, is you don't have to hate Jews. You don't have to say mean things to Jews. You just have to acknowledge that their heritage is different from our heritage, and their future is different from our future. They're a different tribe. They're a different people with a different tradition. And this struggle, we don't share this struggle. And that's the absolute bottom line for me.
So Matt, can you talk about some of the practical politics that you're doing with the Hoosier Nation?
You might have seen my article at the Occidental Observer here within the last couple of weeks. The George Washington Plunkett and the American Sausage Factory, the political sausage factory of American politics, however Professor McDonald worded the title. And in that review of George Washington Plunkett's book, Plunkett of Tammany Hall, I review some of his ideas about practical politics, about how to build a constituency, how to develop influence, how to engage in a contemporary democracy. I think the book is available. The entire ebook is free to download at HoosierNation.us, which is our chapter website. And I think it has a lot of insights, and we're applying those here in Indiana as far as just developing one relationship at a time, working with politicians. We actively engage. We attend these conferences. We try to hold them accountable. We try to support the ones who are supporting us.
Were you involved with Hostetler's campaign? I know Hostetler, he ran for Senate in Indiana, and he's a pretty good guy. I mean, I agree with him on every issue, but he's good on the border issue, and he's been critical about the foreign policy. He wrote that book called, I forget what it's called, but it basically talked about, of course, Nothing for the Nation. He talked about the role that AIPAC had in the Iraq War.
Right. Yeah, it's very disappointing that Dan Coates won. That Hostetler was clearly the better candidate. But we as an organization are constantly trying to improve, trying to find new ways to become better advocates and supporters when we do have somebody like Hostetler who is right on these key issues. Now, I know Hostetler is not a white advocate, but that's not what practical politics is about. We're not compromising.
Yeah, that's the thing is some people, they kind of expect ideological purity and they expect someone to agree with them on every issue, but that's not what you're going to find. I mean, I have several core issues that I look for in a candidate. Number one is securing the border, the immigration issue. The other one is having like a non-interventionist foreign policy. Those are the two core ones. And then there's some other secondary issues, like being against the bailouts and being for fair trade and all these jobs going overseas. And you just have to look at them. I mean, to vote for someone, in order to vote for someone, they have to be right, at least right on the two big ones. And that is difficult because most Republicans do support the war, and most Democrats tend to be soft on illegal immigration. A huge portion of Republicans suck on illegal immigration, and many Democrats suck on foreign policy. So I'm limiting myself to a narrow pool of people you can vote for. But these people who stress absolute ideological purity, and some of these people a lot of these people saying they won't even support Ron Paul. I mean, that's just insane.
Well, they set up this false dichotomy between waiting for the perfect ideologically pure candidate, which just isn't practical. This is a fight. This is a war. This is not some sort of spirit quest. We have to get muddy and make compromises out in the field and try to achieve gains. But they try to dichotomize that against lying about our beliefs and engaging in all these elaborate cryptic ideas about infiltrating the Tea Party and waiting until somebody says the code word and then we all come out of the closet as white advocates and take it over. I don't really know where I've never heard that whole line of thinking drawn to its conclusion, and I'm skeptical about its merit, frankly. But there's a middle way, which is what we're doing here with the Council of Conservative Citizens, where we are explicit white advocates, and we out on the street. So that's a core part of the CCC. They're not just like, but they're still kind of like basically a paleo-conservative organization. Yeah. Yeah, but we in our statement of principles, we are for the European American people. But out on the field, we do what we can for candidates who aren't explicitly racial, but are working for good bills, good illegal immigration bills that will make a difference. They've gotten some pretty decent coverage. Like if you look at Ann Coulter, I know Ann Coulter is a neocon on foreign policy, and she's kind of a warmonger. But I'll give her credit. She did praise you guys' organization, and she got a lot of flack for it. And she's like a mainstream figure within the conservative movement. Right, and if we continue building our competence and building constituencies, the credibility will come over time. I think especially as issues develop in our favor. As the economy becomes more constricting, as neighborhoods become more bronzed with every passing year, more and more people will be receptive to our message, and we need to be out there with that message, and that's what we're trying to do. And we need all the help we can get from people out there, and I encourage everybody to join us. And we're here. If anybody's out there wondering how to help, get in touch with us because there are available positions. What's your official position in the Hoosier Nation? Chairman. Oh, you're the chairman. Yes, self-appointed chairman. We actually have a media director. We have some other people. We're not too worried about titles. I think in a lot of ways the paperwork, the titles and stuff like that is kind of cargo culting, where we spend more time on paperwork and red tape and symbols than on actual work. But we have a lot of people. I don't write the blog post at Hoosier Nation. The guy from nationofcowards.us, Jake Jacobson, has taken that over and is doing an awesome job with investigative reporting. And that's what I'm talking about. And that's not something some people who want to remain anonymous, that's a way you can do it. Is there are so many stories that the media hides, that the media ignores, that are just waiting for somebody to grab a phone or to grab a web browser even and stitch these things together and get the word out.
Like with the machete protest, you picked up on it, but Andrew Yeoman, who I interviewed from Banna, his protest about the film has gotten his group a lot of publicity in mainstream news outlets. So the thing is people can just pick up on these. Just find an issue and then if your organization picks up on it, and that gets it out there.
Right, and that's a good example. The people attacking us, at some point, people have a paradigm shift where the people screeching that we're evil will keep screeching while we're doing all this good work, reasonable work, and we're out there in the communities helping them, and they're going to ask themselves, okay, these people who are screeching that we're evil, that we're all these shut-up words like racist or anti-Semite or whatever, those are the people who are actively working against them, who are actively working to cause them to lose their jobs, who are actively working to invade the world and invite the world and send their job overseas and send the service job that they were trying to get when they got fired or when they got laid off. They're giving that to an illegal immigrant. And at some point, people are just going to have to make a choice. Do you want to follow us who are out there making sacrifices on the street for you, or do you want to keep following these hostile elites who use a bunch of taboos and epithets against us, but have a clear track record of working against you, the ordinary white American family man? And people, I think we're closer than a lot of people in the movement realize to having ordinary people become sympathetic to our views.
Well, Matt, I want to thank you for being on there. So your website is Hoosier Nation, and can you just tell us a little bit about your blog?
Yes, the blog is fair and delightsome. It's delightsome.wordpress.com, and it's a place where I explore some of these ideas about activism, some of the ideology behind it, some of the stuff on radical traditionalism and tradition and politics and faith. It's tribe, tradition, and transcendence. I also have the Hoosier Nation chapter website, which is an excellent source for news both in Indiana and nationwide. That's HoosierNation.us, and I encourage people to check those out, and I appreciate.
Matt, I want to thank you for being on here.
Oh, it was my pleasure.